Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Friday, March 19th, 2021. I feel like we're counting towards something. 1920, 21. Yeah, that is something. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately at this point, given the way 2020 went, I don't want to do anything to extend 2021 unnecessarily without checking out the path ahead. But there's no 18th month, so you know how we do our dates here. We won't have an 18, 19, 20, 21. It just won't happen. We got enough on our hands as things are. Okay, well, it's Friday. Time to get one more show, squeeze one more show out of the week, and we've got some fun stuff lined up for you today. As a matter of fact, we can start with Bill's morning tweet. Kagro in the Morning is live now. This is true 5 days a week, but especially so somehow on Friday. After wishing you all a happy TGIF, those of you who have a G in your life, you're stuck with the F. I can tell you that. You're getting effed no matter what happens. But yes, for those of you wishing one another a happy TGIF, I also will be welcoming Ellie Zupnik of Fix Our Senate today. We'll be talking about that pesky old filibuster, as Bill puts it here, and it is pesky. It's been hanging around quite a while. But yeah, we can, we've, I think, covered all the basics. I'd like to see if we can talk about what Fix Our Senate is up to these days. What's their count on who's where? People are declaring themselves day after day. Democratic senators coming out, sort of laying out their position, and more, of course, of them are just coming straight out and saying, yeah, maybe we ought to just be for elimination of the filibuster straight up. Nothing has changed as far as I know this week with Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, but that's to be expected. The whole point of their existence is to hold out on these things. But yeah, I'd like to get his take on what's happening and his take on what different members of the Senate might be discussing in terms of options along the way. The hot topic these days is, well, if Manchin and or Sinema won't go along with the complete elimination of the filibuster, do we think there's a compromise or some different sort of solution short of getting rid of the filibuster for everything that they might accept? Or are there certain categories of legislation for which they might be willing to eliminate the filibuster or make it more difficult to pull off, etc.? We'll have to see. And we'll see what Ellie knows about it. He's already up and awake and working this morning, as you might expect, because he has an actual job and does these things. And a busy media schedule, I would imagine. So we'll try and keep the channels open. And I expect to talk to him in our last segment around 10:30. So as a matter of fact, what I could do, I don't know. I'm trying to decide whether, is it better to set this up by running with Rich, liberal thinking, that is, our friend Rich, and his last two segments on the filibuster reform issue, and then bookend things with a discussion with Ellie. Yeah, maybe we can try that. I know it's a little early to go to a recorded segment, but it might be a good idea. Give me a chance to settle in a little bit. I've got two short ones here. Let's roll number 5 here. We've got 5 of 6. We've done 2 a day each day. We've managed to remember to roll Rich's contributions. Let's go with this one for the moment, and we'll chime in with commentary afterwards.
Hello, this is Rich, also known as Liberal Thinking. I represent a strong progressive view within the Democratic Party, and I recently posted Busting the Filibuster on Daily Kos. If you don't like the put up or shut up rule, which refers controversial issues to a joint committee for a set time to hammer out a compromise, and you don't like the critical issues rule, which allows the Senate to proceed on legislation to solve vital and urgent problems, then perhaps you will like this final proposal, which gives the opposition plenty of floor time to object to the legislation. This is the allocated floor time rule, which eliminates the cloture requirement in favor of allocating equal floor time to each senator. If a senator feels strongly about an issue, they can take to the floor and speak on the issue for as long as they like, within their allotted time. Time would be allotted based on the available prime time when the Senate is going to be in session, according to the calendar. Typically, the Senate meets about half of the weeks of the year, give or take. That is, 25 weeks. In each week, there are 5 working days, and I've arbitrarily designated the hours of 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern Time as prime time. That's 50 hours per week times 25 weeks, or 1,250 hours, divided by 100 senators, or 12 and 1/2 hours apiece. There's some overhead in running the Senate, but we can probably allocate 10 hours of prime time to each senator to have their say. Of course, they can schedule time outside those hours to speak to the cameras, so this isn't everything. But if, for example, Republicans seriously objected to an issue, then between them they could occupy 500 hours on the floor, railing against its adoption. After that, the issue would come to a vote. If the point is to give the minority time to convince the nation they are right on an issue, then an equal allocation of floor time will do this. It's not quite a fair allocation because Republicans represent far fewer voters than Democrats. That's just an artifact of them occupying states with scattered populations. But within the structure of the Senate, this would give the minority at least a fair say in all matters. This is the rule I think the Democratic leadership should start bargaining with. Majority Leader Chuck Schumer should use this for its negotiating position in case he can't get all Democrats to agree to the put up or shut up rule or the critical issue rule. It guarantees the majority in the Senate can pass any legislation that it wants. It's just that it must first hear out its opponents. This is eminently fair. Please urge the Senate to adopt some kind of filibuster reform that will allow critical legislation, such as the voting rights legislation, to go forward. It is vital and urgent for our country. In the next audio segment, I address the mechanics of passing a new rule to fix the filibuster. You can find out more about the put up or shut up rule, the critical issue rule, and the allocated floor time rule in my post, Busting the Filibuster, in the All Daily Coast Progressives group. Join our group and make your own contributions. We'd love to hear from you.
Oh, right. Well, thanks very much, Rich, for starting us off with that one. I know it was a little early to go to the recorded segment, but I realized, of course, I could use the relief to just double check and make sure that my still at home learning son was up and at least in place in close proximity to the computer while he was up, as my wife is off from work today and wasn't available to do the usual duty of making sure that he's up and about in time, which coincides almost exactly with the start of showtime. And I remembered it about 2 seconds into showtime and said, you know what I can do? Thanks, Rich. I can rely on you to help out so I can go and check everything out. And guess what? Totally responsible and up on his own. And I don't know, for all I know, my wife actually woke up and chased him out of his room while I was getting ready for the show. But everything seems to be fine, so that's good news. Commentary, though, to add on what Rich had to offer us this time. This one going even further afield in terms of coming up with imaginative solutions to the issue of dealing with the filibuster, or finding some way short of eliminating the filibuster in order to try and strike some sort of a deal with the holdouts among the Democratic Party. This one, brand new, like the critical issues rule, although that one is sort of catching on, what he's dubbed the critical issues rule, of just setting certain kinds of legislation aside for protection from the filibuster. And it's totally arbitrary. I mean, except insofar as they've attempted, most of the people thinking about this option, to lay out a rule that would establish an exemption to the filibuster for critical issues like voting rights, civil rights, and various things. I guess, every once in a while you hear people say, what about issues of national security? Always possible, although those are usually, if they're agreed upon widely as issues of national security, those are the bills most, I think, rarely subject to sustained filibuster. But it does happen from time to time. But the definition, of course, becomes a problem. But it is as arbitrary in some sense as just picking out budget legislation and budget related legislation and exempting it from filibuster. Now, of course, that was done by statute, which I suppose is an approach you could take to this thing, but in order to take that approach, you would, of course, need to pass legislation in order to do it, and it would, at the moment, be subject to filibuster. So I suppose it's an interesting thing, and it may be, we haven't really discussed that to date, and that might be something we want to throw into the mix for Rich to ponder as well, and all of the rest of you. Would we want to, once we've managed to dispose of the filibuster once or twice, or move it aside somehow through one mechanism or another, would we want to think about codifying exemptions to the filibuster for certain classes of legislation by statute? That might actually provide some stability to a rule which could otherwise be very easily abused, if not, well, it would be an abuse probably. But, we'd be dealing with a rule, as it's been laid out so far, that was subject to the whims of any new majority that decided that something, for their purposes, whether they were serious or not, was an emergency. They could just do it. Whereas, I suppose, if you set it down in statute, you'd at least have the argument that, well, it ought not to be a matter of the whim of a majority, although I think ultimately it still would be. And you could just pass another such piece of legislation, I suppose. But then, of course, at least there's the check of having it signed by a president. And even though at this point the president would be one of the same party as holds the majority in both houses of Congress, well, elections have consequences, I suppose. So there's possibly some wisdom in considering setting it down in statute as well. But this invention, and it is an invention, I think, in this latest piece, is maybe a little bit more troubling. I have a harder time seeing how this would be implemented. What does he call it? The allotted time rule. Is that what he names it? I don't know. I can't remember whether he actually lays that moniker on it or not. But the difficulty, as I'm trying to ponder this one through, allocated floor time rule. There's two ways that this could work. One is that you could allocate floor time for each bill as it comes up, but then that really is essentially turning the Senate into the House, which I've never had a real huge problem with. The idea, I know the Senate traditionalists always complain about that. You're turning the Senate into the House. Neither one of them are such great shakes, but honestly, at least the House kind of functions, and they have a schedule, and it works. And, senators or House members know what day they're going to vote on something, and even what time during the day they're going to vote on something. And I don't know that senators would be so upset to have a more regular schedule. I think that would be something they could get used to pretty easily. But if you allocated floor time per each bill, that's the only way I could think of it being like truly manageable, and you would get a real handle on what you were doing. But that's essentially just like the House, passing special rules for the consideration of each individual bill that does that. It limits debate time and allocates how much of it will go to the majority and the minority, and doesn't get into the details of who will be able to speak in all that time. But I will say there is some appealing logic in it, just in terms of showing up or highlighting the insistence of some of the Democratic holdouts here, Manchin and Sinema in particular, and there are others who sort of feel like them but are less rigid in their opposition, not quite as rigid anyway. But the insistence that there be minority voice and that things be equitable. You could make them equitable by special rule, I suppose. But I do think the Senate would be very resistant to operating more like the House. And I'm not really sure why that's the case, except for the fact that so many people who have been reluctant to change have fallen back on that old excuse of, well, you can't turn the Senate into the House. I guess there's a little bit of logic to not turning the Senate into the House in the sense that, well, okay, if it operated just like the House, then I suppose you could start wondering, why do we have a bicameral legislature at all? Anyway, on the other hand, there is a key difference. The House members are elected by district. We've kind of long since departed from the ideal practice of trying to make the districts of similar population. I mean, that's supposed to be a guiding principle in all of this, but things have fallen apart as we've had to reserve at least one office, one seat in the House for each state, even when the state's population is relatively tiny. And I don't know how well we've done since we've concluded that, for whatever reason, and this too is arbitrary, that we would leave the membership of the House at 435, and then finding ways to make, like if you did it mathematically, you might approach the problem by saying, well, how big is the smallest state that has to be entitled to one seat in the House? What's the population? And I guess, what is it, Wyoming that has the smallest population? I guess I'm not positive of that offhand, but I think they are the state with the smallest population. I can actually look at Worldometers for that, even though I usually use it for coronavirus information. They have handy information on the populations of the states, so I can double check that. Why not? We'll take a look. So Wyoming, 578,759, the current, I guess, estimated population, what they're attributing to Wyoming. And I guess you would then say, well, all right, the other 330 or 329.5 million people in the United States ought to be broken up into groups of, not that much more than 578,000 in order for the representation to be somewhat even. But that's not nearly the case anymore, and I think you would need a House. I wonder what's the math there? Let's see. If you have this is going to be all math, the first segment of today's show. How exciting. Let's say that 330 million minus the 500,000 there, 329,500,000 people divided by 434 remaining districts. I guess we're not that far off. 759,216 is what you'd be shooting for, I guess, then, for all the rest of them. But even so, even if you did that, Wyoming gets away with representation for 200,000 fewer people in the same single seat. Plus, of course, you have Vermont, which is under that number, 625,000 or so. D.C., which has a representative in Congress, it doesn't get a vote in the full House, but also another 700,000 people. Alaska comes in under that number. North Dakota comes in right around that number. So right away, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seats off the top, really. So anyway, we don't do a particularly good job at actually making it even. So the House has always kind of been off kilter. And when you get around areas of really concentrated population, in New York City and places like, New York City and Los Angeles, just densely populated cities, carving out an area of 750,000 people and doing it in ways that have, districts that aren't completely ludicrous looking, and you see some of the weirdest creations ever when people are really gerrymandering the maps, but you get the idea. But finding, carving off sections of 750,000, it's difficult to do. I mean, they try to, stick to some formula of equity in reapportioning everything, but it would probably help a lot if we increased the size of the House, but we haven't done that in quite a while. I do see occasionally people advocating for that, but we don't see it get very far. We got a lot of problems as it is. Anyway, I guess the real point is that it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world necessarily if the Senate really operated anyway more like the House, but just on a different basis. You elect 2 senators from each state, regardless of the size of the state. I mean, I don't know if that's really working out very well anymore, but if you're a real traditionalist and you don't want to amend the Constitution, and it would be a pretty big change to some very basic civics education for people if we change the basis on which you elected people. It would be a little wacky, but I don't know any reason like why operating with a more predictable schedule and making sure that every piece of legislation that is brought up for consideration on the floor of the Senate actually comes to a vote, that we pay these people to make these decisions, make the damn decisions, is so much like the House that we can't possibly countenance this. We elect them on a different basis. It's of a very different size, a more intimate group. States are equal in their representation, and that was the only real difference that was absolutely necessary. And it's probably worth reminding people again in that part of the discussion that the filibuster was never supposed to be part of like the founders' original vision of the Senate necessarily either. Anyway, just thought I would point some of that stuff out. But before getting around to the other question of this equal time rule, the only other way I could see this thing working, and the way it's described in Rich's segment, I mean, it sounds like it makes a certain amount of sense, except then I'm realizing, are you really talking about allocating an entire year's worth of floor time all at once? And while, I mean, I guess in the context of, well, we need to pass this one piece of voting rights legislation, it makes a certain amount of sense. But you see what he's done here. I think I have the text of it here. He mailed it along. Okay, yeah, right. So time would be allotted based on the available prime time when the Senate is going to be in session, according to the calendar, which, okay, so you force them to make up a calendar early in the year. If this is the way they're going to operate, they can manage this sort of thing. They project their calendar for a year or so ahead of time, and they deviate from it all the time, but they do project it. So by his calculations, by Rich's calculations, the Senate meets about half of the weeks of the year, and they could change that too, by the way. So about 25 weeks out of the year, and each week 5 working days, and that's not really the way it works right now in the Senate. They tend to take off for a good portion of 2 of those 5 working days, but again, maybe they shouldn't, and they should work this way. And designating, roughly, what does he give it? 10 hours a day of prime time, 50 hours per week, 25 weeks, 1,250 hours divided by the 100 senators, or 12.5 hours apiece. That's equitable, but is it workable at this point? I mean, what you're really talking about is telling each senator at the beginning of each year, you have 12.5 hours of floor time available to you on everything. I guess what happens here is that you start off with this premise of, well, we need to pass this one bill, and then you allocate time by year. I mean, I guess what this means is the first time you hit a truly controversial bill that the Republicans really don't like, that's the end of the legislative calendar for the year. And if it's your first priority, if S1 is brought up right alongside HR1, or they just take up HR1 without bringing their own version of the bill, you're basically saying the only business for the year is going to be this S1. And we're going to use up every one of our senators, well, every one of the Republicans anyway, is going to use up their time. And maybe then you get to another bill. I suppose then at that point, I mean, if that's really the rule, then senators will say, am I really going to put 12.5 hours? Not only am I going to be able to speak for 12.5 hours, but I'm not going to be able to debate again for the rest of the year. I mean, that would be a very draconian check, obviously. And if it were somehow to become the rule, you would find, I guess, senators being much more judicious about their time. But I just don't see any way in the world they agree to a rule that forces them to allocate their speaking time on bills yet unknown for the rest of the year, beginning in January. I mean, but it would be a very draconian measure, that's for sure. And if it were somehow the rule, I guess then maybe the strategy would be to bring up something like S1 right away and say, you guys who oppose it have to take the gamble. How badly do you oppose this thing, and how much of your time do you really want to use? But there, so I don't think it's something they would ever agree to, and that's something you can't lose sight of. And we'll get back to that when we play the second segment, the final segment of this piece, about how Rich envisions convincing senators to make this change. By what mechanism would they make this change, or be convinced to make this change? One of the things you really have to keep in mind is that the Senate is deeply personal to a lot of these senators, particularly long-timers who consider themselves institutionalists, whether they deserve the title or not. And they are not keen on other people telling them how to run the place. Even though it's supposed to be our place, they don't really view it the same way exactly that we do, and that has to be part of your strategy. So I don't see any way that, frankly, that you get them around to the idea of something as radical and different as this. But it's very worth pointing this kind of idea out, because what the hell, at this point we'll take anything. I mean, nothing's dumber than the idea that by doing absolutely nothing but threatening to do something, you can derail an entire legislative agenda for a year or more, decades if you have enough dedicated opposition, I guess. That's not a particularly smart rule, and I don't believe that proposing that, if the rule were somehow something else, to senators would get a lot of support either. So I guess you can keep that in mind. We'll discuss it more after the break. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning. I have good news to report. Many more listeners like you are making critical contributions that keep our show on the air. Makes good sense, of course, and patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple. Now you can make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for helping keep you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We literally could not do this without you. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Yes, so pondering it just a little bit more, it would require an awful lot more rules change in order to make something like this work. But like I said, it's worth pondering because, when you're talking about a rule as ridiculous as the filibuster, and remember that there is no rule that enshrines the filibuster. It's simply something that has grown up to fill in the gaps within the rules. There's no rule allowing a filibuster, and there's no rule disallowing it. There's just rules about how to end debate, and the thing has grown up around that in the as a negative impression of the gap in the rules. But the idea of allocating floor time for an entire year certainly seems like, well, it's definitely something senators would just reject out of hand. But even if you somehow magically got them to agree to it, well, I suppose you could tinker with the numbers. And remember, Rich is just giving an estimation of how many prime time, as he calls them, prime time hours there are in a working year of the Senate. I imagine this would change things a little bit, and the working year of the Senate might change, and that's fine, and they could adapt to it. And I guess you might want to think about, well, how could they abuse it? For instance, if they were allocating, I don't know. I guess it depends how the rule is written. If each senator is simply, if we do the math in the background and don't make it part of the rules, and simply say each senator has 12 and a half hours allotted to them at the beginning of the year, and they can break it up any way they want, that would be a huge change, obviously, in the way the Senate works. in a way, but in some ways it might not be. Think about this. It seems like, if you were a senator, probably, and somebody said to you, well, you have 12 and a half hours to speak the whole year. Well, I mean, tell that to me, who does 2 hours a day, 5 days a week on the show. I'd be at a time on Tuesday of week 2, right? But then I waste an awful lot of my time, and consequently yours. You're here, I'm here, right? It's our time. But senators, I mean, well, for one thing, they usually have a speech ahead in front of them and some plan of what to say. But because they're unlimited in their time, very often they just do things extemporaneously. They have a couple of notes, or they just want to talk things out. And Rich sort of mentions that in passing, the overhead time for running the Senate would be a real surprise. And anybody who's watched the Senate and watched the way senators can drone on, you know that they can't allocate just 12 and a half hours to themselves for the full year. But there are a lot of senators who very rarely appear on the floor and just don't speak on the floor a lot. Sometimes they spend a lot of time in the media, and there's no shortage of footage of them on the news, and so you might not realize how inactive they are on the Senate floor. But then there are a lot of senators who do both as well. And so for some senators, I guess that would be fine. It would be really interesting to conduct a study of floor time and how it's allocated now, and show me a study, and I imagine people would demand it before adopting a rule like this. Show me a study. Show me how many hours each senator actually currently uses. There would probably be some senators who would have room to spare at the end of the year. Then there would be others, the floor leaders, just by the nature of the way the institution works, they tend to spend a lot of time on the floor speaking, and not about legislation, but about the administrative work. But sometimes, obviously making mention in passing of what legislation is coming up and what they plan to do about it. But, the idea of planning for the year seems kind of daunting and maybe more work than senators are willing to assign to themselves. And then there's the question of, basically one half of the rest, or I don't know how many hours there are and the rest of the schedule. I mean, I guess if we're saying 10 hours a day are prime time, then there's 14 non-prime hours out there, and there's nothing that says you can't hold the Senate in session overnight and around the clock. And I don't know what happens to those other 14 hours a day times 5 times 25. And then, of course, if they decide to be in session more or they decide to be in session less, I don't know. And I don't know how you write the rule. And what about a majority leader who says, yeah, sure, everybody gets 12 and a half hours, but I'm just not going to bring the Senate in except for, 14 weeks a year. And is there some sort of guarantee for every senator that they get that time? And can they yield it to one another? And what happens if somebody just says, I'm not going to use any of my time, but I'm going to call for quorum calls every 15 minutes? And the current rules would have to be addressed about how they deal with quorum calls, because all it takes is one senator to suggest the absence of a quorum. There's no stopping the thing, essentially, because once one senator says, I suggest the absence of a quorum, there's no discretion typically from the chair. They just simply say, the clerk will call the roll because somebody said the magic words, and the clerk starts to call the roll. Now, currently they don't abuse it too badly, so they haven't really done anything about this, but the clerk starts calling the roll, and then you can stop things by unanimous consent, but then again, one senator can destroy unanimous consent. So right now, the way things stand, one senator could come to the floor and just say, I suggest the absence of a quorum, and they start calling all the names, and then somebody says, I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the quorum call. That person, if they're there, objects. They can filibuster by quorum call until at some point, perhaps the chair either refuses to recognize them for the purpose of calling for a quorum call, or they say, well, you've done it 987 times in a row. I think at this point it's fair to say you're being dilatory here. But right now, the rule is that you can just do that, and you can waste the Senate's whole day or year, I suppose, if you're really dedicated to it, with quorum calls. And I guess maybe the better question is, well, how much time do the senators' time allocations, are they adjusted if you start running out of time towards the end of the year and there's no way to give everybody the 12 and a half hours that they wanted, or some senators have time left but the year is ending? What happens? Do you raise their pay and give them money back? I don't know. I guess you could do that, right? How about that for an incentive? Not only are you limited to 12 and a half hours for the entire year, but if you don't use it all, we'll pay you more money. Anyway, it's an imaginative thought. And I guess it's an illustration of how far afield your thinking can go if you're just looking for, how else might the Senate operate? And I guess that brings us to segment number 6 here, the question of how would you convince the Senate to do any of these things? And here I have some issues too. Maybe I can comment right along with them this time like I did with the last 2 segments from yesterday. Rich, please.
Hello, this is Rich, also known as Liberal
Rich.
Thinking. I represent a strong progressive view within the Democratic Party, and I recently posted Busting the Filibuster on Daily Kos. Now that you've heard an enormous number of options for fixing the filibuster, how do we get the Senate to act? The key to getting all senators on board is to get their constituents to demand they fix the problem. Democratic leadership could help us do that by requiring each Democratic senator to solicit input from their constituents on what they think is the best fix. This forces senators like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema to face the problem. If these senators don't want to participate, the DNC could send a survey out directly to Democrats in all states to ask for their preferences, stating how important it is to the nation's welfare and urging constituents to contact their senators to fix the problem.
All right, I'll pause here to say, okay, I have faced the problem head on and in this specific context of how to get senators on board with a filibuster fix or reform. And it's only about half the problem, if that. Convincing senators that they want or need to do something because their constituents demand that they fix the problem. First of all, of course, 50% of the senators anyway don't believe that their constituencies want the problem fixed. Even if they really did hear from a majority of their constituents, they are members of the Republican Party and are dedicated at this point in time to the proposition that either that no, their constituents really don't want the filibuster reform, despite the fact that 70% of them who write to them about this issue say the opposite. The silent majority really wants the other thing, or they don't care what their constituents want, or they think their constituents don't know what they're talking about, or that their constituents don't matter in this particular issue in terms of what to do with this rule of procedure. And that's a real thing, because there are quite a number of Senate Democrats, in my experience, and certainly in my first go-round in talking to senators and staffers and other Senate-adjacent personages about the first round of filibuster reform push, that aren't particularly interested in it. And they say, the Senate is where I work. It's my workplace. We do the people's business there, and I want to have and require having my constituents' input on issues of policy making, issues of substance. But as far as issues of how my colleagues and I will do our work, I'm interested in their input, but it's not something that I consider. Even if I am a Democrat, capital D and small d, lowercase d, Democrat, it's not necessarily the case that these senators strictly believe that their constituents ought to be able to determine how they'll do their work. And that's actually relevant to the second part of this clip, and you'll see how in just a minute. But yeah, part of the reason that the filibuster reform poses a challenge is that it is an internal rule, and they guard it rather jealously. This is about how they spend their day and how they work with their colleagues. And that's why, we found that a relatively successful filibuster reform effort in 2009 through 2013 required what we called an inside-outside strategy. There would be a portion of the strategy in which we did prevail upon constituents to prevail upon their senators to say, look, this is just ridiculous. You're not getting any of the things you need to do done, and it's exacting a terrible price on the country, and you must move. And so growing constituent pressure means something, but it only means something less than half of what senators are interested in. The other source of input that's very valuable to senators, and here we targeted these folks too, is we said you also spend an awful lot of time talking not only to one another, but we'll face facts. You spend a lot of time talking to lobbyists, professionals inside Washington, D.C., some of whom do their work on behalf of awful, evil corporate clients whom we really, really hate or whatever, and some of whom do work on behalf of wonderful clients for whom we stand, one nation under God, indivisible, et cetera, but for whom, or about whom we think much more positively. And, sometimes it's not even an actual organization, but you're lobbying on behalf of, whatever, food stamp recipients. There's not a union or anything that they're lobbying on behalf, but clearly people that we would like to see prevail in this debate. Sometimes it is an organization as such, like a union, lobbying about things. So, there's good lobbying and bad lobbying. But the point is that there's very definitely a community of political, strategic, and policy-making professionals that has grown up around the legislature. That doesn't necessarily include people in the legislature at any given time, but they've spent some time there. They know how the place works. They know how senators feel about the way policy is made and the process by which they work. And they also know, senators and staffers know, that these are insiders who understand the actual operations of the Senate, the actual pressures of running for office, etc., in ways that, frankly, constituents often don't. They understand a very different and very important element of what it takes to put together a successful bid to win a seat in the Senate, yes, but the lobbyist community, for lack of a better term for it, also has a very good idea of what it takes to stay there, what it takes to govern while you are there, and govern in such a fashion that it's likely that if you want to come back through the next election cycle, you will. And it takes both kinds of understanding to understand how a senator works, because they have a foot in both worlds. The response to constituency, because you have to stand for election, and response to the institution, because you have to deal with 99 other senators in order to get things done. And that can be a very personal game. And it doesn't translate very well. It certainly doesn't translate very well into answering, let's say, pointed and angry questions at a town hall back in state. Well, we want you to implement XYZ policy. Why won't you do it? Well, you got to understand that I'm working with 99 other senators, and they all have their quirks, and this one wants this, and that one wants the other thing, and this one doesn't want anything necessarily in particular in this subject area, but wants something in this other subject area, and this one believes differently about how they represent their constituencies than I do, and I got to deal with all of that. And it's not just a matter of placating an angry crowd in city A of state X and how they feel today. There's a whole world out there that has to have a stake in how this stuff is worked out. And I could promise you anything here. I'd really like to make as many of you happy with me as possible, but making you happy doesn't fix the problem that a senator from, state Y is going to have with this issue. His constituents might feel differently. Her constituents might feel the same way but want it done a different way in legislation. or for a longer period of time. And I have to deal with that. And yeah, I can promise you I want things this way, but there's going to be a compromise out there. And I'm going to come back and you're going to say, yeah, you just don't have enough spine to stand up for the way we want it. We made it clear in no uncertain terms that we want it exactly like this. It doesn't work like that. And they resent the assumption that it does. So yes, there has to be sort of an inside, I think, an inside and outside proposition to this. You have to talk to people who understand how things work and convince them that they can convince senators, yes, I understand those pressures. You know that because I work with you all the time. You trust me and you know that I know how things really are here in the Senate. I too am telling you that this has to change. It's not just people who say, well, I want this to happen, so therefore I demand that it happen, and I won't vote for you if you don't do it. Senators learned a long time ago that those kind of threats usually mean that it's a person who didn't vote for you the first time and has no intention of voting for you the second time, or they don't really mean it and they forget about it because when push comes to shove and it's a chance to pull the lever for somebody who, either me who disappointed you at that town meeting or this person who says there's such a thing as quote unquote real rape. What are you going to do? Right? So they know that very well. So it was very important to have people who senators knew from experience to have the same sort of understanding of how the Senate operates and how individual senators operate as they do, also saying there needs to be this reform. So it's not necessarily the case, for instance, that you would be able to change a critical mass of minds by sending out surveys or asking each Democrat in the Senate to go back and ask their constituents and listen to them when they say that they want to change. Of course, there's also this bit of misunderstanding. If the Democratic leadership were to require, as they say, for each Democratic senator to solicit input from their constituents and then say that forces Manchin and Sinema to do this, to face the problem, or if they refuse to do it, because obviously they could and probably would refuse to do it, that the DNC would send surveys out directly to Democrats in all states. That's just not a business that the DNC is in. This is another sort of widespread misunderstanding of what the DNC does. The DSCC might possibly want to do something like this. They're all affiliated, but they don't run one another. The DNC doesn't dictate to the DSCC or the DCCC what to do and how to do it. That's just not the nature of their relationship. The DNC, despite the fact that it's a national committee, isn't in the business of either running the Senate or House races. The DNC exists essentially for the purpose. Every 4 years, it comes out of mothballs, holds the Democratic National Convention, sets down the rules for delegate selections and nominations, and then pours all of the money it's managed to collect in the last 4 years into the presidential race, and it does very little else. It's not a national clearinghouse. It's not a Politburo for the Democratic Party. So the DNC wouldn't necessarily do it. Did the DSCC do it? Well, they would be more in their issue area, I guess, their area of responsibility, their bailiwick. But also remember that the DSCC and DCCC, we run into this problem all the time, are member services organizations. They are chiefly funded by dues paid to them by the Democratic senators, incumbent Democratic senators, and Democratic members of the House, members of Congress, for the purpose of pooling funds that they can put behind the races to keep incumbents in office. And then if there's some money left, maybe sort of kind of help out with consulting or perhaps a little bit of funding for challengers to try to flip red seats to blue. But their chief responsibility is to the members who pay dues to them, and they will, of course, pursue policies that reflect the interests of the majority of those members, and there are very frequently disputes between individual members and the organizations. And historically, the organizations have been rather loath to fight it out with individual members or withhold support from them, because the mission of these organizations is retaining these seats, even when rank and file Democrats find themselves displeased with these particular members. They really have to go way out of their way, way far off, a huge departure from mainstream democratic principles agreed upon by all before any of these organizations will enforce rules or punish members. So it's really difficult to even imagine how you force Democratic senators to do anything, even if it's something as innocuous as serving their constituencies for their opinions, which, typically they ought to be doing by themselves anyway. But that gets us to, I guess, part 2 of this last segment about what to do and how to implement any fix that you manage to convince all 50 Democratic senators to agree on. Let's roll that part.
Presuming all 50 Democratic senators are willing to go forward with a solution, it is a straightforward matter to change Senate rules. The Constitution says, quote, "Each House may determine the rules of its proceedings," unquote. There is no supermajority set in this clause. A simple majority is the default, and that means a majority in the Senate can determine its rules for considering legislation. The Constitution does not set any limit on when the rules can be changed, so this change can be adopted at any time.
Okay, and we'll pause again here. Now that is, of course, the basis for the nuclear option and why it would work, or the constitutional option, however you term it, and even if you mean slightly different procedures by those terms, as I do. That's what underlies all of this. The prerogative of each house to determine the rules of its proceedings. The problem is, as is often the case when people bring up, well, this is, by definition unconstitutional. It's yes, if everyone agrees on that definition, but it's not always the case that they do. And it's a complicated thing, but at bottom, it generally tends to, it holds that each house can determine the rules of its proceedings, and that's why with a simple majority, they can change the precedents or set new precedents such that it's like, in effect, like having changed the rules, even if they haven't done so. But it's not necessarily automatic that it follows that because the Constitution says each house may determine the rules of its proceedings, that's all there is to the story. Because, what do you do with the counter argument that, the Senate has determined the rules of its proceedings, and the rules of its proceedings say that in proposing a change to the rules of this House, if there's disagreement and extended debate takes place over the rules change, the rule that they've determined for themselves is that it will take a 2/3 vote of those present and voting to invoke cloture on a proposal to change the rules. That's the way the rules stand currently, and I have no doubt that a significant portion, particularly of the conservative wing of the court, would look at the claim that this was by definition unconstitutional to require anything else. They would say, you're right. The Constitution says they can determine the rules of its proceedings, and there is no supermajority requirement here in the Constitution. What this means is that the rules change itself may be adopted by majority vote, but the Constitution is likewise silent on whether or not there can be procedural hurdles set up to getting to that vote. And it doesn't say they can't, but what it does say is that each house can determine the rules of its own proceedings. If that doesn't apply to procedural rules, I don't know what it applies to. So they've set up this barrier, but they've done so under a constitutional prerogative, and you can't just come here and say, that thing is unconstitutional. Not that people haven't tried to do that. There was a very ambitious case filed during our first round of filibuster reform efforts that made this case it just didn't get anywhere. So I just want to let you know that's been tried and hasn't met with a great deal of success. Let's just continue on here before we run out of time for our segment.
Also, any attempt to stop the Senate from adopting a rule for its proceedings by anything other than a majority is unconstitutional on the basis of this clause.
Just what I
The
was
Senate can adopt any new rule with a simple majority. In the case of a tie, the Vice President will cast the deciding vote. Please urge the Senate to adopt some kind of filibuster reform that will allow critical legislation, such as a voting rights legislation, to go forward. It is vital and urgent for our country. You can find out more about options for ending the filibuster in my post, Busting the Filibuster, in the All Daily Coast Progressives group. Join our group and make your own contributions. We'd love to hear from you.
All right. Well, okay, we're just about up to our top of the hour break, which is just fine. I think this fits in nicely. But yes, that does cause, as I said, a certain interpretational problem. It's true that they have the prerogative to change their rules at any time. And I guess one of the rules that they could determine that they want to change is the rule about what is necessary for cloture on a rules change. But they have so far avoided that completely. And even in the implementation of the nuclear option in 2013 and 2017, they have avoided saying and avoided doing those things that would, in fact, change the standing rules of the Senate. Instead, they've simply said, well, we will establish new precedents in the interpretation of those rules, but they have not felt the same way, we'll say, about what their constitutional prerogative is about actually changing the standing rules. They've avoided that, and maybe for good reason, and it may be that no court would touch this thing eventually anyway. We'll see. But we'll be right back to discuss it some more. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We've managed to spend an hour already on the filibuster reform issue, and we'll be spending the last half hour back on it. So what do we sandwich in between? Well, we can wrap up this discussion simply by saying, again, it's worth discussing each of these ideas up front, and in particular, even this one that I have this particular problem with. And you could probably spend hours and hours parsing the question of what might happen with a court challenge, and I guess you'd have to be talking about a court challenge if you are, if you propose that anything that prevents the Senate from simply adopting new rules, either wholesale or piecemeal, by majority vote at any given time, is a blanket blanket pass for the Senate to do any of these things. It's not clear that the Senate at any time has ever agreed that that was actually the case as a whole, though there are plenty of senators who would come down that way and decide on that. I can see that there's a lot of room, strategically speaking, for those in opposition to throw up these roadblocks, like the idea that, well, yes, the Senate can adopt new rules by majority vote, and the vote on passage of those rules always requires nothing but a majority vote, and it's always been the assumption. The only question is whether or not there can be a supermajority requirement for cloture that allows that vote to take place. Once you clear that hurdle, then and only then might the resistors say, does the constitutional prerogative kick in. There is no supermajority requirement, and never has been, they would argue, for adoption of a rules change in the Senate. The only thing that requires a supermajority is whether or not you can hold the question of whether or not and when you can actually hold that vote. Now, most people who have made this claim, and those who have filed suit in the past to enforce this argument, to basically say, well, that's an artificial construct here. The fact is that the Constitution clearly contemplated these issues coming to a vote and then being determined by a simple majority when it did. And the idea that a supermajority can be required if not for the vote itself, then on the question of whether or not to hold the vote is an artificial construct meant to unconstitutionally prevent us from exercising the authority clearly given to us in the Constitution. And it's a pretty good argument too. Where you run into the problem is, I guess, the flip side of the surety with which senators approached the constitutional and or nuclear option and saying, if we make this decision, if we push forward and say that we will change at least the precedence of how the existing rules are interpreted, and with a simple majority say from now on we'll interpret this rule to mean 50 votes are necessary rather than 60. The only option available to opponents at that point, if we get our 50 votes together, or 51 votes together, is to sue us and say that we improperly brought this measure to a vote, and to point to the existing rules still standing rules of the Senate that say that either 60 votes were necessary to pass this particular bill, or that what you're really doing by setting a new precedent is changing the rules, and that requires 67 votes to even get to a vote on whether or not we're going to do that. And therefore, according to the rules of the Senate, these decisions were taken improperly and cannot stand. The problem there was, and this was in the corner of the proponents of changing the filibuster rule, was that the courts would say, this is a political question, and under that political question doctrine, it's got to be left to the Senate to make its decision. And that, ironically enough, is based on the same premise that Rich reminds us of, that each house may determine the rules of its proceedings. The courts, for the most part, have been loath to say that we, as a totally separate branch, as the Article 3 branch, will intervene in the Article 1 branch and tell it how and whether it can determine the rules of its proceedings. It's a pretty clear constitutional prerogative to Article 1, and we're not going to interfere in it. And by the same token, though, if you were to sue proactively, and I think this is kind of what happened with the suits that I'm aware of that made this argument, if you were to sue proactively without having taken the decision, and say we're looking essentially for a declaratory ruling from the Supreme Court that says it would be unconstitutional to stop us if we tried to change the rules this way, they will say it might be, but you haven't changed the rules this way, and we're not going to tell you whether you can or can't. It's a political question, and you have to decide it. You can't ask us to clear the way for you. You can do it, and someone can ask us to try to undo it, and in all likelihood we'll say we can't undo it because we're not getting involved in something like this. But if that doctrine, if the political question doctrine is applied more or less the same way, no matter how the question is asked, then don't sue, go do the thing and see if anyone can stop you in court. Probably they can't. Of course, you do have the problem of now you're talking about a court with John Roberts and Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett and Clarence Thomas, and so you're just looking at a bad lineup all around. So it's not like you're in good shape. You're not gonna. It's not gonna help any help from Alito either. There are still some liberal justices who might be able to help you, but the problem is that they too are perhaps more wedded to the political question doctrine than anything else. The conservatives might go out of their way to break the political question doctrine and help you affirmatively if you were looking to block filibuster reform, whereas the liberals might not be willing to say that they would depart from the political question doctrine to be counterweights to the conservatives, who aren't being particularly conservative in this case. You get the idea? It's actually not that clear a resolution. And so if you're going to do, if you're going to push things through by force of a bare majority, you're better off just going and doing it rather than leaning on the Constitution for legal support. But I don't know that that's exactly what Rich is talking about either. This is just sort of justification for going forward, and it might work in that sense. You need political justification or legal justification. Here, each house may determine the rules of its proceedings. Yes, but what if someone countersues? Well, they'll probably lose. This court, it's a little bit questionable, but you shouldn't let the fact that interventionist so-called conservative justices might reverse you improperly on this stop you from doing the thing that you think is right. So there's always that argument. Okay, I think we could probably wrap it up for the moment, but we'll just take a brief break from the filibuster news and discussion and return right to it in the 10:30 segment when Ellie Zupnik joins us and gives us a eye on the practical happenings inside the Senate right now, what they're thinking, and where they want to go with this stuff. All right, let's see. Other issues of interest. Maybe we could even keep it on the filibuster issue, but wouldn't that be boring? Let me throw you a different curveball since the weekend is coming up. One of those stories or lines of discussion that crops up every once in a while that looks like, hey, this could be an important thread in how we regard current events, but it hasn't quite caught on yet. But if we start discussing it now, you'll find that this is a thread that others are going to tug at in the next couple of days, and you'll say, I was well prepared by KITM. This is something, and I know it'll be on some of your minds because I saw Greg Dworkin retweeting it earlier. And though he came into the thread that he was retweeting at a slightly different point, and now I feel like I should perhaps start at the top of it, he was retweeting, I think he was retweeting someone who was retweeting a thread from Chrissy Stroop. Who is Chrissy Stroop? I don't know is the answer. Checkmarked kind of person. And here's how she describes herself in the Twitter bio here. Not a theologian, so that much we know. I came here to chew gum and dismantle Christian supremacism, and it turns out there's no such thing as virtual chewing gum. Get the idea? Okay. Clearly someone, I think, who spends a lot of time being watchful of and critical of the evangelical Christian movement in the country, who makes an excellent point about the news we at least touched on earlier in the week, the horrific murders in the Atlanta area of, I think, 8 women at various spas. Many of the 8 killed were Asian. And, immediately our thoughts turn to hate crime and perhaps the responsibility of Donald Trump and his supporters in stoking prejudices by insisting on blaming China and Chinese people and Asian people in general for the coronavirus pandemic, which, has varying levels of crazy to it. But there's another element of what seems to be happening here that Chrissy Stroop doesn't want us to sleep on, and it's not unrelated, and it's not a different explanation. It's just an accompanying explanation, and I think she also goes to great pains, and you should give her this latitude anyway, to ensure people that she's not discounting any of the other motivations, and it's no kind of excuse. But you may have heard that the alleged shooter, the suspect in this case, or people around him anyway, are floating alternative theories of the crime, let's say, some of which I'm sure are aimed at trying to acquit him of this crime, but offer some different explanation besides racism against Asian and Pacific Islanders, and we want to try to remember to include them in our definition here, but I mean I think we're largely talking about mainland Asian people in terms of his alleged prejudices, but okay. I don't know. He may also have problems with Pacific Islanders. You might want out of this one at this point. But anti-Asian bias, but also, of course, misogyny and various issues with women in general that he's taken it out on, Asian women in particular. But there's something else driving it, and here's Chrissy's theory on it in full from the beginning of her thread anyway. She starts out by grabbing the Daily Beast's reporting, and the Daily Beast's incredulous reporting on this somewhat unbelievable, I don't know what it is. It's not an excuse. Maybe it's a counter explanation for this idea, but it doesn't, it's the sort of thing that doesn't hold water on first, second, or third glance. You might have seen the Daily Beast reporting on it. Their headline, you can see the eye rolling, I guess, in the headline coming. Massage parlor rampage killer floats sex addiction claims. And then the eye rolling grab quote from apparently the Cherokee County Sheriff, who helped float some of these ideas, which is also questionable in its own right. He has some issues. You may have seen pull quotes from the Cherokee County Sheriff saying, well, he had a bad day and this is what he did. And everybody was like, oh my God, how far out of your way do you have to go for serial killers at this point? This keeps happening with white and white supremacist serial killers getting this weird kid glove treatment from the local law enforcement people. And we know what's behind that story too, but that's actually not the subject of the day. But rather this re-examination of the not widely accepted in more progressive and liberal circles excuse of sex addiction. What the hell is that? And what are you even talking about? And why would that enter into it? And if you just like to have lots of sex, why are you killing people? Because lots of people like sex and don't kill anybody. Well, actually, a lot of people who really like sex do kill a lot of people. That's unfortunate, isn't it? And, we did have a whole civil war over people's addiction to their sex with their slaves. But again, another day's issue. But Chrissy Stroop picks it up here, picks up the Daily Beast article, and notes essentially the Daily Beast is looking at it like I said, eye-rolling at this whole thing and dismissing this weird excuse like that he's affiliated with one church or another, and people who knew him saying things like, he wouldn't even cuss, the woman said. He was big into religion. And we find ourselves once again looking at this thing and saying, again, these people who say they're religious or who are big into religion, and then, sort of throwing out one of the 10 Commandments in a pretty big way, right? How do you square this sort of thing? Well, Chrissy Stroop begins looking at it this way. It looks like externalization of self-hatred by a purity culture warped youth pastor's son. This is going to pack it all into one opening statement and then kind of justify it along the way. Looks like externalization of self-hatred by a purity culture warped youth pastor's son. Church taught him he had a sex addiction and to objectify and blame women who quote unquote tempted him. This is, I think, getting at the heart of the matter of what is this sex addiction claim all about? I mean, I think we're supposed to be open to the idea that this is actually a thing, although it's very difficult to understand. But, we're willing to be open to the possibility that there is such a thing, and that, sometimes people who have it don't murder anybody, and maybe they are inappropriate with certain aspects of their sex life, and you could work it out through therapy. But as an excuse for murder, well, probably not going to stand very long. But let's look at this, what Chrissy has to say here. Mass murderer Aaron Long, and maybe we shouldn't bother publicizing his name, reportedly told police he sought to, quote, eliminate temptation by murdering sex workers. Yes, we've seen this movie before, but this time it's got a very specifically evangelical inflection, and it's worth looking at that. How do you reconcile? Well, he was a religious guy. How could he? It doesn't make any sense that he would go around, one, murdering everybody, and two, murdering sex workers. Like, if you're a super Christian, how do you know any sex workers? Well, here's part of the answer here. In evangelical churches, boys are taught that they are, quote, lust monsters. And I could see them teaching people like that. I have no experience with it personally, but geez, sounds like something I could believe. The person who most often conveys this message is, isn't this a fun surprise, the youth pastor, Long's dad in this case. Long's sex drive was likely normal. I have no basis to conclude that. Likely Chrissy has no basis to conclude that either, but statistically speaking, most people are going to be in the range of normal. And it can happen this way. What she's saying, his sex drive could have been perfectly normal, but he was taught through church that it was evil and that it needed to be repressed until marriage, which is just a dangerous and explosive situation all by itself, because if that's the teaching, well, you're a monster. And you really need to suppress your monstrous urges until you get somebody to marry you, at which point you are legally and religiously entitled to be the monster you always wanted to be, so long as you focus all of this destruction and rage on this one poor person who has agreed to be your life partner. That's not really a great basis on which to then say, by the way, this whole thing is blessed by God. Go for it. You probably should have to work out those issues ahead of time. But okay. Anyway, this is a very important part of it. Long's sex drive could very well have been normal, but he was taught it was evil and needed to be repressed until marriage. This leads many evangelical boys to think they have sex or porn addictions, and that's in scare quotes. Generally, these addictions aren't addictions. On this, see the work of Joshua Grubbs, PhD, and you can do that online on Twitter if you find that easiest, because you can find him at Joshua Grubbs, PhD. And that's the whole thing. No spaces, none of that stuff. 2 B's in Grubbs, a psychology professor and researcher in the study of addiction, personality, and sex. So follow along. Anyway, in the meantime, before you go and have this conversation with him, Chrissy continues, yes, while this sometimes leads to self-hatred for boys and men, that is self-hatred, not directed outwards, a lot of blame, nonetheless, placed on women and girls along the way. A lot of blame placed on women and girls whose quote-unquote modesty is policed by church and the church members, and who are often blamed for their own molestations or rapes. If they are abused or assaulted, even if they're abused and assaulted by a male church leader, they're often forced to, quote-unquote, confess to, quote, their part in this, quote, sin. It becomes a ritual of sorts inside the church and in the ministry groups with the youth ministers even if they're the ones that assaulted the girls. Well, you need to confess your part in the sin by tempting me into doing this. And, I guess if you base your whole worldview on the idea that there's a devil that makes you tempted to do things and it's not your fault, somehow it ends up being your fault if you're the girl, but not your fault if you're the boy, because the devil made you do it, and nobody made you be the victim. You just were walking around being a victim, and you probably should have been wearing a burqa or something. Even though if you did, we would condemn you as unchristian if you were wearing a burqa because you actually believed in its necessity through religion, i.e. a different religion. Anyway, so that's kind of an amazing aspect of this this part of the story. In many cases, even if the victim of a pastor or other prominent man in the church is underage, the child sex abuse will be framed in their discussion of it, in their condemnation of it, as an affair. Like, no, that's a rape, not an affair. This is the background that seems to underlie Long's murder spree. It's interesting that his family helped the police catch him. I would guess that part of why they were able to do so is that Long had confessed his, quote, sex addiction to his dad, or maybe to somebody else, but possibly to his dad. In short, this case has specifically evangelical, toxic masculinity and purity culture written all over it. It's a supposition at this point, but it's one that I think is likely enough that we ought to explore it. Even if it doesn't explain this situation, it may explain others. The attitudes described above are pervasive in evangelical subculture, and misogynistic violence, like the murders that took place yesterday, is a logical result. None of what I've written here is meant to justify Long's heinous actions in any way. He chose to murder members of a vulnerable population, Asian massage parlor workers. They are the victims. Evangelical purity culture is toxic, but Long's indoctrination does not absolve him. Further thoughts she offers before wrapping up on this subject and on this thread. Further thoughts, including comments on the intersection between white supremacism, we're dealing with that these days, misogyny, that too, and evangelical purity culture are contained here in the linked article in my latest for religiondispatches.org, and it is linked in the tweets at the end in a piece entitled, if we can get to it quickly enough, yes, Don't Discount Evangelicalism. Don't discount evangelicalism as a factor in racist murder of Asian spa workers in Georgia. So there you go. Let's see. There's one last concluding tweet in this. Since the thread has blown up some, I'll just do this work for her. Why not? If you find some of her work helpful, know that freelance fees alone don't pay the bills. I depend on support of readers like you, and I'm deeply thankful to, you'll never guess, Patreon patrons like me. I also am grateful to you. Please consider joining them if you're able. So if you happen to be particularly struck by what Chrissy Stroop has to say here and want to offer up some support on that front, Patreon is the place to do it. Patreon, of course, a wonderful place to offer up support to all sorts of creators of all sorts of content every day, all day long. I know we have so many people who do that here. As a matter of fact, maybe that's a great way to end this segment before we're turning to the filibuster subject with Ellie after the break. There are a number of people who, since my last go-round of thank yous on Thanksgiving Day, have joined up, and maybe I would take this opportunity to mention some of their names. Let's see. Lucian Giordano, who actually contribute via PayPal rather than Patreon, but we thank you very much. Among the new Patreon patrons, and some not so new, C. Williams, just the first initial there. Peter Burgess, thank you very much. Also to Andrea James, Jeff Caldwell, Craig, I'm going to try on your name here, Craig Faustnacht, have I got that right? Pamela Reese, Leslie Sterling, another initial here, Paul W., I don't believe we have a Paul Waldman out there who's contributing. There's a Paul Waldman, of course, the columnist, but I think he probably would have let me know if it was him. But if it is, thanks a lot, but we'll just take it from Paul W., whatever your last name may be. And you're very welcome to keep your anonymity if you wish. And if you want to be cited in some other way, please do feel free to send me a note to that effect. Also thanking Eugene Chen, Judy Goldman, and some of our newest contributors now, Matthias Allen, and via PayPal, another partial name here, and a identifying location, Jeff in Northwest Indiana. Thanks very much to all of you, of course, and to all of you whose names I have read in the past, and maybe we can make it a Thanksgiving tradition to thank you all at once, but I would like to keep a little bit more current with these things from now on so that we're not thanking people months and months after they've made their contributions. We appreciate it. Chrissy Stroop, I'm sure, appreciates it as well. And we'll make sure that you appreciate it even more when we return and talk to Ellie after this. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Time for our closing segment. We've been talking about the filibuster reform, about 20 years. But today, lots of discussion on it. And Ellie Zupnik with Fix Our Senate is with us, as promised, for our last segment. Good morning, Ellie. How you doing?
Good morning. Great to be here.
Okay. Well, we'll see about that. We'll see if we can make it miserable for you. Much in the news, of course. Filibuster reform, huge movement in terms of getting individual Democratic senators to state their positions openly about changing the filibuster or eliminating the filibuster. I imagine you've been following that pretty closely as like a whip count on what's going on. Do you have a firm view, a firm idea of what the numbers are like at the moment?
Well, first of all, I'll say that I feel like we are in an incredible position right now. If you have followed this issue for a long time, you remember the fight that we had in 2013. At this point in 2013, we were way behind where we are now. We are seeing that, I think what we saw with the American Rescue Plan, the COVID Rescue Bill, when Republicans refused to come on board, when not a single Republican would join with Democrats on a bill that had 70+% support, that highlighted right away to Democrats and the administration that Republicans just weren't going to come to the table. They had no interest in being a partner in governing, and that if Democrats wanted to get anything done that couldn't be jammed into a reconciliation bill, they were going to have to confront the filibuster. Yeah. I think that, combined with what we're seeing across the country on voter suppression and gerrymandering and the For the People Act that's coming from the House to the Senate, along with so many other bills like the Equality Act and the PRO Act, raising the minimum wage, gun safety, the immigration bills that just passed yesterday, all of them are facing the prospect of a Senate filibuster, not just the prospect, the certainty of a Senate filibuster. They're going to slam right into that brick wall. Senators have, over the past couple of weeks, senators and President Biden have confronted that, and it's been so encouraging to see them confront that realistically and be honest and open about the fact that they would love to have Republicans on board with these things. Of course, that would be great if these could be bipartisan bills, but if they're not, then we saw Senator Schumer, Leader Schumer, just last night on Stephen Colbert's show say failure is not an option. They're going to get them done whether Republicans are with them or not. So I feel really good about where we are. We still have a long way to go. We still have a couple of Democratic senators who are, while expressing openness to reform, are still reluctant. There's going to be the devil's in the details when it comes to what kind of reform we are actually looking at in the end. That's why we think that the best thing to do is eliminate the filibuster, but I feel like we're in the best possible position we could be right now before a single bill has even been filibustered.
Yeah, well, I agree, and we've done, the many years of work have paid off, and renewing the work we've done has paid off, and it makes sense that it would pay off a lot more quickly. And this time around, there has been, we've already taken care of the struggle of, one, convincing advocates of all sorts of important legislation and policy areas that the filibuster stands in their way. This is a common issue, a common enemy, and that everybody who has anything that they'd like to see accomplished legislatively ought to be keeping an eye on the filibuster and thinking about joining a coalition like fix our Senate, and it's worked. It has worked in the past, and it's worked a lot faster this time because the argument's been made and everybody understands it, and they just needed a rallying point, and you're provided that. And also, of course, the work of convincing members of the Senate and staffers and other important operators in Washington, D.C. that this can happen. Having seen it happen in 2013 and 2017, there's no mystery to it anymore, thankfully. But every once in a while, everybody needs an explanation of exactly how it can happen again, and having a clearinghouse for that information like yours is invaluable in accomplishing that. So now we find them ready to wade in, and they're doing so in greater numbers and more quickly than they did last time. That is excellent. This time we also, though, have the added difficulty of the filibuster itself that they're focusing on this time around. A lot less focused. That is to say, it affects, of course, all sorts of bills, legislation that they chose to aim at nominations last time. I think was sort of a baby step at getting people who were reluctant to rid ourselves of the filibuster entirely on board for a narrow purpose. And I see that being presented as an option this time again, too. Actually, I'm a little curious about your own position and the Fix Our Senate position on considering these, I guess, half measures, even when it's something like, well, we'll eliminate the filibuster for certain classes of legislation. I'm not certain exactly how you limit those classes, but on the other hand, maybe you, like me, are not that worried about it because the argument against it is that it will collapse of its own weight and end up eliminating the filibuster entirely anyway. So, okay. But your own preference, I mean, is it best for them to just be honest and sweep the whole thing out of the way, or will you take what you can get, or what?
That's a good question. So I think that the filibuster should be eliminated. I think that I agree with you and so many people across the country who have seen how the filibuster has blocked progress, how it's become a weapon of partisan obstruction. Anyone who thought the filibuster was something that promotes bipartisanship and compromise, it's clear that that's just not the case anymore, if it ever was. So I think it's time for the filibuster to go. There's no reason to keep it. It's not doing anything productive. In fact, getting rid of it, I think, will lead to a more productive, better functioning Senate right away, and certainly over the long run. But that being said, it's encouraging to hear senators who just a year ago, or even just a few months ago in some cases, were saying they wouldn't do a thing to change the filibuster, now saying that the filibuster is broken, that the status quo is broken, and expressing openness to some reforms. That's the way these things happen. They happen when members who were once opposed now see some openness to reform, and then once they look deeper into it and once more and more bills are blocked and obstructed, that openness to reform maybe could turn into more openness to reform. So I'm, again, very encouraged to hear senators like Senator Manchin, like Senator Tester, senators like Senator Klobuchar be vocal about this. We saw Senator Heinrich last night come out and say the filibuster should be eliminated if it gets in the way of progress on these critical bills. This is progress. This is due to the hard work of activists and advocates for 15 years on this front, and it's paying off now as we hit the moment where Democrats are in control. Democrats made campaign promises, and the filibuster has turned fully into that tool to block anything and everything. So right now it's an abstract issue. It's academic. Nothing's been filibustered yet because we've had an impeachment trial, nominations that can't be filibustered, and a reconciliation bill that can't be filibustered. But pretty soon it's going to get real, it's going to get very real, and senators are going to confront that choice when a bill is filibustered, potentially a bill like the For the People Act, and the openness to reform that they are expressing now is a great place to be as we move into that moment.
Yeah, well, there really has been a lot of movement, and actually you make a great point that not only has there been movement more quickly this time, but yeah, there really hasn't been an opportunity to demonstrate once again, at least during this Congress, the destructive power of the filibuster. This is all anticipatory. And so to see so many senators changing their view on things and changing their position on things before there even is a filibuster, although sometimes they're couched in terms of, well, I anticipate a lot of resistance and a lot of abuse of the filibuster, and if and when that happens, I'll be ready to do it. But last time or in previous fights, it's taken watching major legislative initiatives fail to convince anybody that there was a problem. At least they have this institutional memory and can say, I know what these Republicans are like, and I know what they're about, and I know how they'll react to these things, and I'm acting in anticipation of this. So again, we save some time.
I think that's exactly right, and I think that what our greatest ally, it's funny to say this, but our greatest ally in this fight is Senator Mitch McConnell. He does not miss an opportunity to show his Democratic colleagues, to show the Democratic caucus very clearly what he is, where he stands, and what he will do. And from the beginning of this Senate, the first action of this new Democratic majority was Senator McConnell blocking an organizing resolution, a basic standard procedural vote to allow the Democratic majority to take control of committees. He blocked that in order to extract a commitment from Senator Schumer, from Leader Schumer, that they would never change the filibuster. Schumer refused to do that. McConnell backed down, but Democrats saw right from the start that McConnell was committed to obstruction. And they've seen that for years, from what he did on Garland and the Supreme Court seat, to how he changed the rules on the filibuster himself. He went nuclear himself the moment he needed to what he did reversing his own McConnell rule on Supreme Court justices and jamming Justice Coney Barrett onto the court at the very end, to rule change after rule change and norm breaking after norm breaking. When he was in charge, he said the people in the majority have the power. The rest, they make policy. The minority goes home. And I know it was galling to many Democrats in the Senate to see him try to assert power from the minority after denying them that when Democrats were in the minority. And they're frustrated, they're sick of it, and you're hearing that expressed in these recent comments from senators. And I think they're going to be ready to act on that as soon as this obstruction becomes real.
Yeah, well, that could happen at any moment, and I guess as we move to the rest of the legislative calendar, they're rightly anticipating all of this. You're right. You make a great point that he's certainly the best advocate for filibuster reform. It's hard to call him an ally, but I get your point. Once again, he's also, by the way, made this same speech, 100 times in the past, making threats about what he'll do to grind the Senate to a halt if there's any changes, and that they'll, the whole place will be unrecognizable if you do this, and will retaliate against you. Although, again, once you've smashed the doors of the Senate in and threatened to kill the Democratic leadership, I don't know how many cards you have left for making the service in the Senate miserable. I know he disavows anything to do with the January 6th insurrection, but he didn't vote to hold anybody accountable for it either. So he's got that on his record. That makes things difficult, and I think that probably did change a lot of Senate minds and say, these two things are not unconnected. We've gone way past the point where we can think of our Republican colleagues as colleagues. It certainly should no longer matter what the opinion of a Josh Hawley is on how the Senate should operate in polite society. He's got no idea, and we shouldn't be worried about the effect on him. But yeah, they've heard this song and dance from McConnell before. I am always, I think we've mentioned it before in our discussions too, constantly amazed at how it's a central theme for McConnell that we will retaliate if you do this. And it's never really picked up on in the media that, the same goes in the other direction as well. And McConnell makes threats and executes on those threats all the time. And then I think you should expect, according to what McConnell told you to expect, that when Democrats regain the majority, there will be changes that Republicans don't like, for the same reason that they feel perfectly at ease printing them when McConnell makes those threats. Why they're surprised that Democrats make the changes they want to make when they take power, I have no idea.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think what we're seeing from Senator McConnell is desperation. He knows that the filibuster is the tool that he has to maintain power from the minority and protect his special interest allies, block progress, make sure that nothing that Democrats have promised voters can actually happen. And he wants to run the same playbook he ran in 2009 when he obstructed and he delayed, and he knew that he would reap the political benefits, which he did when Republicans took the House in 10. They took the Senate in 14 because they were able to credibly go around the country and say, Democrats promised you things. What are you seeing? You're seeing gridlock and dysfunction. Republicans run on the idea that government can never work, that it's dysfunctional, that it's a failure, and then they do everything they can in government to make that a reality. The filibuster is a tool that allows them to do that. Senator McConnell is desperate to keep it, and he knows he can accomplish most of his agenda, if not all of his priorities, without the filibuster. We've talked about this before. He can get tax cuts for the rich through with a simple majority because of the reconciliation carve-out. Mm-hmm. He can confirm Supreme Court justices and judges across the judiciary with a simple majority. Those are the things he cares about, so he is perfectly happy to have a world where the filibuster exists to block progressive and democratic priorities, but not to block the things that he actually wants to get done. That's a fine Senate for him. So his message right now, in fact, he said this explicitly 2 nights ago on the Senate floor, he said, it's not broken. There's no reason to fix it. I think a lot of Democrats and a lot of people across the country would disagree with that. They look at the Senate and it is broken. It needs to be fixed. So that's, again, why I feel good, because he is defending the status quo. He is saying it ain't broke, don't fix it. Democrats are starting to say, wait a minute, it is broken. We need to fix it. And they know that the filibuster is a big part of what is breaking it.
Yeah. What about the various proposals for, I guess, what they're aimed at, maybe accommodation with the more reluctant senators like Manchin, Sinema, some sort of focused or limited reform? Is that even something that do you deal in that at all? Or is it simply that, we support the elimination of the filibuster in full, so we don't discuss these options, or is that something you're willing to talk about with senators?
Sure. We're willing to talk about anything that would move us in the right direction. I think we support eliminating the filibuster. That's where we stand. That's our message to senators and our message to activists and advocates, people across the country who care about raising the minimum wage, immigration reform, getting the DREAM Act done, LBGT rights, Equality Act, and anything else that will be filibustered. Our message to people across the country and to the people we work with is tell your senator to get rid of the filibuster. That is what is blocking it. But again, we think that the highest priority is getting these bills done. This is not about a Senate process or a Senate procedure. It's about the issues that impact people across the country and the promises that Democrats made to address those issues and to make progress on those issues, and then actually delivering on that. So, when members talk about different reforms that are short of elimination, the devil's in the details, and it has to be. We would have to scrutinize them. We would have to make sure that they don't become just new tools for McConnell to obstruct or delay or grind the Senate to a halt. We need to make sure that in the end, after a reasonable amount of debate, after the minority has plenty of time to give input, there's an actual up or down vote, and there's a way to end the debate and get senators on the record where a simple majority can pass a bill. That is the prism through which all of us should be viewing any kind of reform. Is at the end of the day, can a majority, which, by the way, I think you've noted before on the show, the Senate majority represents 41 million more Americans than the Republican minority, even though it's a 50-50 split. Yes. So it is not just a simple majority. But that tangent aside, at the end of the day, a majority needs to be able to pass what they said they were going to pass. And if there are 50 votes plus the vice president to support a bill, at the end of a reasonable period of time of debate and deliberation, that bill should be able to get to a final vote. So all of these conversations, from talking filibuster to putting the onus on the minority instead of the majority to produce votes to carve outs, they should all be viewed through that prism. And if we can't get to full elimination of the filibuster right away, then certainly those are the kind of options that should be considered if they move us in that direction.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, I think that you've made the key point there that to keep in mind, which is that you haven't gone into this, and none of us really have gone into this, because our main concern in life is Senate procedural rules, although it might not be true for me. But okay, I do have other concerns. But yeah, the reason people are interested in this one thing that concerns me is what you've said. This is really about delivering on legislative priorities. And I guess that makes a very reasonable position, I think, to say, well, there's no reason to be absolutist about how we approach the filibuster, the eventual elimination of the filibuster, or even if it's incremental reforms in the filibuster. We're doing this so that critical legislative agenda items can move. The best and most logical and fairest and purest way of handling it is to say, well, majority rules is a pretty good rule, and we've kind of agreed to live by those rules in every other aspect of our lives. To the extent you want to make sure that the minority has a voice and input, you can do it. And you can do it in a number of ways. But yeah, we ought to be rid of the filibuster. But if what it takes to get there is piecemeal activity, that's fine, because at bottom this is about delivering on these priorities and stopping the ability of this one abusive tactic from getting in the way. So I think that's a very practical approach to things. And I'd be interested to see how it breaks down and how it comes to pass. Are you getting any indication? I know we know certainly more about Manchin's openness to discussing these topics, but have you had any contact lately with his office? Or are they holding themselves out as separate? Who do they talk to about filibuster reform besides Chuck Schumer, if anyone?
Well, we're having conversations with as many folks in the Senate as we can, and we're definitely encouraging groups that are involved in Fix Our Senate, groups outside the Fix Our Senate coalition to get involved as well, make their voices heard. I think like we know who senators listen to. I mean, we think we know. We think they listen to their constituents. They listen to the people who care about the issues that they want to advance. Some of them listen to their donors. Some of them listen to their big political activists in their state and nationwide. So we are doing everything we can to reach these members wherever they are. And it's not going to be us, Fix Our Senate, that does that. It's going to be or Fix Our Senate alone, certainly. It's going to be all of the members of the coalition, all the members outside the coalition, and people across the country. I'll be honest, Senator Manchin's probably not going to care what Fix Our Senate says about something. He will care about West Virginia residents and what they say about something. He will care about the labor groups that support the PRO Act and the workers in his state who are in those unions who care about increasing their wages and who care about worker protections and who care about making it easier for unions to fight for their workers. So our role as Fix Our Senate is to arm and support and help and encourage all of these different people and groups, organizations to do what they can from where they sit to connect with their senators and advocate and agitate and push as hard as they can for the filibuster to be eliminated. But people across the country have been stepping up. We just added 43 more groups to our coalition. We're now over 60 members, including groups like Newtown, March for Our Lives, Guns Down, the Women's March, Equality Arizona, long list of groups. Daily Kos is in our great group of organizations. We take everyone. We have pretty low standards. I'm just kidding. And it's growing every day. We have more organizations joining the coalition and people outside the coalition, other coalitions, other groups doing amazing work on this front. And this is it's gone beyond the inside wonky world. It's gone beyond Politico and The Hill, even beyond Daily Kos, and we saw on Colbert last night. I mentioned Senator Schumer was on Colbert.
Oh, yeah.
It was on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. 2 nights ago, he did a whole segment on filibuster with the history of the filibuster and why it needs to be eliminated. This has gone beyond the political, wonky, even activist world and into more of the public's understanding that this is something that is a big problem. And if right now Congress has a 35% approval rating, most people think Congress is doing a bad job. They are starting to connect the dots between the dysfunction that they see and the lack of progress and this outdated Jim Crow relic that's being abused to stop anything and everything from getting better.
Well, it is an amazing march we've seen. It only took 15, 20 years to get it this way. But yeah, I mean, that's the sea change, I think, that we've always been hoping for, is that this is a common topic of discussion. And it's always been an informal metric for me to see if it's moving from the political discussion into the general discussion, is whether the late night talk show hosts are discussing it, and does the Daily Show touch on it, and moves it into the realm of almost into popular entertainment where people can pick up on it. It's not quite so wonky and nerdy as all that if it's presented to me in my nightly entertainment, and that's a helpful step. And you've anticipated the last prepared question anyway that I had was about the expansion of your coalition and new groups that have joined. Is that a fair way of describing the way you do most of your contact with senators, that it's not a matter of fix our Senate arriving on the Hill for a lobbying day so much as the members of your coalition speaking to them as familiar players in the Washington world? Is that how you would describe how your coalition members work with senators, or no?
That's right, and it's a couple of different levels, and this is, anyone in the advocacy world would be familiar with this, but it's there's a level of a group in our coalition or on their own reaching out to a senator and talking about their issue and then saying, well, and are you willing to get rid of the filibuster to get this issue done? So there's that level of direct engagement with the senators at their level. They have their government relations people, their lobbyists, all these different organizations at the highest levels, from Brady to communications workers, March for Our Lives. They have direct relationships with these senators, and they talk to them all the time, and they are now aggressively and correctly connecting those dots. But then there's also the level of their membership, and they have groups like Indivisible and Stand Up America and Brady and March for Our Lives and Protect My Care and Working Families Party. They have engaged, fantastic memberships that are now learning more and more, and many of them have been learning more for years. More of them are learning more about this issue, again, connecting those dots between the issue that they care about, whether it's gun safety or labor or healthcare or immigration, Voto Latinos in our coalition, and many others. They are connecting those dots, and their members are now armed and ready and engaged and activated to go to their senators, whether it's in Arizona or West Virginia or California or New York or anywhere else across the country, and make that direct ask themselves. And I worked in the Senate for 10 years. I know that voices from constituents matter. Unless senators are ready to lose their next election or have just hung it up and are given up, then they care about what their constituents think. And there is nothing more powerful than voices of constituents asking their senator for some change and for results. So that's how we're going to win this. Keep that pressure going, keep people engaged, and then I think we'll get this done.
Yeah, I think so. I think you've got the right approach going there, and a good emphasis on constituent pressure, but across a spectrum of ideas and a legislative agenda, and everybody has their own approach to it. But if it all comes back to this one thing, that's a message that resonates all by itself. I'm hearing from all sorts of people, not only constituents and interest groups, but people hear about guns, hear about women's rights, hear about LGBTQ rights, hear about labor rights, saying the same thing. it's been pretty effective. Thanks very much, Ellie, for coming by and updating us on this. It's getting to be an exciting time. So the heat's turned up. Appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
All right. We'll talk to you again soon, I'm sure, as, probably as first elements of the legislative agenda come under threat and we start to see how this fight will take shape and what options the Democratic caucus will present to itself for how to do it. I hope you'll join us then.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, take care, Ellie, and we'll hand things over now to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, coming up next right here on Netroots Radio. And let me see if I can't give you a quick preview about what he's got on tap in a way that doesn't run beyond the music after this.
From netrootsradio.com, you have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
So let's see what's on tap. Dang, I meant to look at this, but I was busy thanking Ellie for coming on. So we'll just leave it at that. How we'll do it that way. No, plenty, of course, to come up next from around the country and around the world. And if I try to chime in now, I'm just going to go beyond the music like I did yesterday. Wasn't that fun? We'll see you next week.